Our text is from the first book of Samuel in chapter 30. And David said, with what the Lord hath given us, the share of the man who stayed with the luggage is to be the same as that of he who went down to battle. All will share alike. David's 600 men were in an ugly mood. They were tired and angry and utterly demoralized. They had just returned a 60-mile march from the Philistine battlefront, and they found that their little village of Ziklag had been sacked and burned to the ground. Everyone and everything, women, children, stolen away. While they were gone, the raiders of Amalek swept out of the desert, pillaged the border towns, and then disappeared again into the desert where they came from. There was a tense moment, for they all blamed David, and they talked of stoning him to death. But David prayed. He strengthened himself in the Lord his God, and he rallied the troops. Let's go after the guys who did this. And so they made a forced march 15 miles south till they came to a little brook by the name of Bezor, where 200 of them could not go one step farther. They were, in Bible language, dead on their feet. And so leaving 1/3 of their number behind, the 400 pressed out farther and deeper into the badlands of the wilderness. And they weren't having much luck at picking up the trail. The wind had blown the sand over the tracks. Weary hour, mile after mile, it looked like David had led them on another wild goose chase. And then, out there in the middle of nowhere, they found a man lying in the sand, an Egyptian, still breathing, but more dead than alive. He was one sick puppy, and these guys had better things on their mind to do and take care. But the hospitality of the wilderness that they had learned over the years kicked in. They stopped and gave him to drink from their goatskin of water, a piece of raisin cake to eat. It turns out the Egyptian was a slave of one of the Amalek chieftains. And as they made good their escape, he fell sick. So his master just left him behind to die in the desert. And that sip of water, that raisin cake, were the best banquet he had ever had. Well, David could stop for the guy because David knew something about being badly treated in the wilderness. And he knew something about being treated generously. A priest had once given David consecrated bread from the altar and a sword at a time in his life when he was faint with hunger and unarmed. A woman once brought a mule train of provisions at a critical moment when David's men were starving and were desperate. David could say it in a psalm because he lived it. I have been young and now am old. Yet have I never seen the righteous forsaken, or his seed begging bread, for they are always generous and lend freely. So, the fellow was grateful to these men who had saved his life. And he told David what he knew. The raiding parties were going to rendezvous at an oasis to divide up the spoil. He knew exactly where the place was. And he could lead them to that very spot. And he did. It was dusk when they got there. And the party was just starting to roll. Amalekites everywhere. Feasting and drinking and dancing and raising a whoopee over the spoil they had taken. They made good their escape. Put many miles behind them. Posted no sentries. Sensed no danger. No weapon in any man's hand. And never dreaming that other eyes were out there in the dark watching every move. And to David and his guys, they looked like sitting ducks about to become dead ducks. With shouts of vengeance, David and his men fell on them from every direction. And with a fury like that of a mama bear who's been robbed of her cubs. All the night till the next day. And the only Amalekites that escaped were the guys who took charge of the camels. The victory was complete. Everything recovered. Every wife, every child. Plus an enormous amount of booty. So they headed back home in high spirits. These men who were so angry were now ecstatic. Hours ago they talked about stoning David. And now they're chanting, "They shall defeat, they shall defeat. To David belongs the spoil." That sounds like the climax of the story, but it isn't. The climax of the story comes when they get back to the brook Besor. The 200 are waiting, soaking their sore feet in the water, feeling bad because they couldn't take part in the action. And now they're on their feet, hugging and kissing their wives, and feeling left out of a victory that they really didn't do much to bring about. There were mean-spirited men, however, among the 400. They bristled at the thought of sharing the spoil with their weaker brothers. Give them back their wives and children. And nothing else. Not a sheep. Not a goat. Not a single silver camel chain. It wouldn't be fair for those who lagged behind to get the same share as those who fought the fight. Then David stepped in. And this is the climax of the story. David intervened right then. And his intervention was sheer gospel. David ruled that day that all of them were equal and they would all share equally. The 200 who were left behind guarding the baggage and the guys who went and fought the battle would each get the same share. And David's logic was this: everything we have is a gift from God, and all of us will share it all with all whom God has saved. The guys, the fair share partisans, are called in the text wicked, sons of Belial. That's pretty strong language for guys who are just saying what you and I assume is common sense. Plain justice. But you got to remember where they came from and who they were. These men had come to David out in the wilderness, remember, in Bible language? The distressed, the debtors, the discontented. Not exactly what you'd like to print on your resume. A ragtag bunch of misfits if there ever was one. And yet, through no merit of their own, they had been caught and lifted up in the net of God's mercy and salvation. That victory over Amalek, you going to take credit for that? They were about to stone David to death. And it was only by David's praying that they tried to save their family. And that Egyptian, who planned that? Who would have guessed that man would lead them to the camp of the Amalekites, and that through him they would get back their wives and children unharmed, unmolested, and a whole lot of wealth to boot. Everything they had experienced, every step of the way, was sheer grace. They received from God a generous and marvelous grace, and therefore they were duty-bound to show that marvelous, generous grace to others. And that story's not far-fetched. Whoever won a greater victory over the powers of sin, death, and the devil than Jesus? But now what if? What if? He shared the spoils of that victory only with people who deserved it or earned it. Who, pray tell, might that be? Caiaphas, the clergy? Pilate, the governor? Herod, the king? Or these friends of his? One of whom betrays him, another of whom blatantly denies him, all of whom disown him and abandon him, and least of all, that malefactor, that thief on the cross. And do you know something? He's the only guy in the story who says what's fair. We hear him calling to his companion in crime. You want fair? You and I got fair. We deserved the due rewards of our deeds, and now we got it. He wanted something else besides fair. He said, Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. I can't think of one reason in the world why you should. I cannot now turn over a new leaf, for I've just come to the last page of my book. I cannot promise to walk in the paths of righteousness because my feet got nails through them. And I'm not able to make amends because my hands are fastened to a wooden beam. And to that man, Jesus gave it all. Grace and mercy and life unending. Verily I say unto thee, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. You don't get into the David stories very far before you notice that David is a man of passion. He throws himself passionately and wholeheartedly into whatever's in front of him. Singing, praying, worshiping, fighting, loving, yes, and even sinning. But David was a compassionate man. That means passion to David was a community affair, as in compassion, a passion for others. David didn't want a salvation that included only him and nobody else. David didn't give a rip about his personal security at somebody else's expense. He didn't want to save his soul and to heck with everybody else. David cared. He was a man of compassion. Christianity, if it teaches you anything, it's got to teach you that. You have to care and be compassionate. Now, it should not have been a surprise to me, but it was, to discover that the word Besor, Brook Besor, means good news. Gospel, in other words. Get it? There are people today If you asked them where their address was, they could tell you. I live by the brook Besor. Weary, worn out, too tired to go on. They've been sandbagged by some physical disability, sidelined by the infirmities of age, left behind in the dust by the movers and shakers of the world who are always too busy to even notice them. But everybody who lives by Brook Besor has one assurance, unexpectedly and undeservedly, of God's grace. Weary, tired, worn out, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, Jesus says, and I will give you rest. And every single time you do, He does. Amen.